right, well, let's go ahead and kick things off. Welcome to MPN Pathways, Empowered Voices and Research Participants. We are very glad that you're here today and want to really thank you for your time and your dedication to MPN research advocacy. If this is your first time joining these webinars, I would just want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Douglas, and I'm the Director of Patient Engagement at MPN Research Foundation. So I will be your go-to contact as you really go through this program. This is now the fourth session of the MPN Pathway series. So to review any of our prior sessions or to access those evaluations for certification, please visit the MPN Pathways landing page on the MPN Research Foundation website. And then we want to make sure that you mark your calendars for August 14th. We'll be joined by Patty Spears for a special MPN Pathways webinars on patient and caregiver voices in research. So this session will really explore how patient and caregiver insights can drive innovation, improve research, and influence decisions across the development continuum. And we are also hosting an upcoming bonus MPN Pathways session on September 11th, which is MPN Awareness Day, but this will be to introduce the MPN Progression Registry. So we will walk the MPN Pathways participants through what it is, how it works, and how your participation can drive deeper understanding of disease progression, improve treatment approaches, and to ensure future research reflects the real-world experiences of patients like you. We do want to take a moment to recognize and thank our MPN Pathways sponsors and collaborators for their support of this program. And then just a few housekeeping items. For tonight's presentation, we encourage you to place any questions in the Q&A feature during this presentation. Our great team will be answering questions as the speaker presents. Please only utilize the chat feature to communicate with one another. Questions can be missed by our panelists if they're put in the chat, but we do encourage you to introduce yourself, say hello, say where you're from in the chat, just so you can kind of connect with other MPN patients and caregivers. But if there is time at the end, which we plan that there will be, we will ask our live questions to our speaker, and we'll definitely take advantage of that. But any questions that are not addressed, we will be following up with those in an email. And also as a reminder, we do apologize, but during this session, we are unable to answer any personal questions related to your direct care or treatment. But we encourage all participants to email patientengagement@mpnrf.org, which you'll be connected to me so we can help you navigate the right resources and education and help you with any of those questions that you can ask your provider or help you find an MPN specialist closer to you. Tonight's presentation is being recorded. That link will also be provided to the MPN Pathways group after this webinar. And then the evaluation of this session will be sent to you in a post-event email. Please be sure to complete the evaluation for this session to earn credit towards your certification. And then before we do kick things off, I want to provide a little context for how organizations like ours have collaborated with the FDA. So in 2019, the MPN Research Foundation hosted an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting with the FDA to ensure MPN patients could share their real-world experiences directly with regulators. The key takeaways were very clear. Patients face a significant symptom burden, including fatigue, bone pain, and cognitive issues that really often go unaddressed. So these symptoms deeply impact daily life and emotional well-being. Existing treatments are often poorly tolerated or simply not effective enough. We captured all of this in the voice of the patient report, which is linked in your slides, submitted to the FDA in 2021, which now serves as a tool to guide future drug development and regulatory decisions. So this collaboration really underscores how important it is to include patient voices throughout the research and approval process so that new treatments truly reflect patient needs and continue to bring these experiences to the FDA. So with that, I would really, we're honored to have Sarah Wicks here, Associate Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. Sarah advises drug and biologic companies on FDA regulatory and compliance matters across the product lifecycle, with deep expertise in FDA interactions and enforcement. What sets Sarah apart is her commitment to really elevating the patient voice in drug development. She plays a leading role in planning externally led patient-focused drug development meetings and partners with advocacy organizations to ensure that research and regulatory decisions reflect what really matters most to patients. And so with that, Sarah, I will go off camera and turn the reins to you, and you just let me know when to advance.
Sure. Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Sarah. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Wicks, and I'm a regulatory attorney at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, which is the largest FDA dedicated law firm in the United States. We are located in the heart of DC, which is about an hour away from FDA's headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland. As Sarah mentioned, I help drug and biologics companies, particularly those developing products for rare disease, navigate the FDA pre-approval gauntlet to bring promising therapies to patients who desperately need them. I'm also a strong advocate for the patient voice in drug development and work to bring the patient community, industry, and FDA together to bridge the gap between FDA's approval requirements and the needs of patients. I'm so happy to speak with you this afternoon and provide an overview of FDA's regulatory framework for approving new drugs and biologics and how the patient voice shapes FDA decision making. Next slide, Sarah. So very quickly here, our main objectives will be to learn about the types of evidence the FDA looks for when approving new drugs and biologics and where FDA's authority for doing that comes from, whether it be in laws or regulations. We will also explore FDA's flexibility and expedited pathway since not all drugs follow the same approval pathway, especially when they are for serious or rare diseases. And we'll also learn how the FDA considers patient experiences and perspectives when making an approval decision, which is where you come in as patient advocates. Next slide. Before we go further, I do have to clarify with my classic legal disclaimer that everything I say today reflects my own views and experiences and not necessarily those of my firm, the firm's clients, or any other organization with which we are affiliated. Next slide. Now to the good stuff. When a pharmaceutical company, or you'll also hear me use the word sponsor, submits a marketing application for a new drug or biologic to the FDA, the agency reviews data that's intended to show the drug's efficacy, which means does the drug work, and also safety, which means is it tolerated by patients. Today, I'll be focusing primarily on evidence relating to efficacy. Next slide. There are three broad classes of efficacy evidence that the FDA considers when making an approval decision. The first being conventional, which is FDA's gold standard. Administrative flexibility, which are special paths that allow for flexibility when there is a clear unmet need. And lastly, case-by-case flexibility, where FDA uses its scientific judgment when unique situations arise. Next slide. First, let's unpack the conventional pathway. Back in 1962, Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FDCA. These amendments required that a drug not only be safe, which was already required under the original law, but that drugs also be effective. Essentially, the FDA must see substantial evidence consisting of adequate and well-controlled investigations, including clinical investigations. This means for most drugs, two independent, adequate, and well-controlled clinical trials with statistically significant results on endpoints that matter to patients, like symptom improvement, survival, or better quality of life, are required for approval. Some key points to help you better grasp this concept and what the high burden is under this requirement. Adequate and well controlled basically means the trial has a control group, often a placebo or whatever the standard of care is. There's also clear plans before the trial starts about what to measure and how to analyze those results in a statistical way, and that there are enough participants in the trial to provide a reliable result. The trials must also be prospectively defined, which means that before anyone knows who's getting the drug or who's in the control group, the sponsor lays out a plan in writing that is submitted to the FDA, describing what they will measure as the primary endpoint and also any secondary endpoints and so forth, but that the primary endpoint must hit with a p-value of less than 0.05%, which in statistical terms means that there's a less than 5% chance that the result occurred by random chance alone. Finally, the endpoint must reflect how a patient feels, functions, or survives. For example, instead of measuring a lab value that might or might not translate to meaningful patient benefit, the trial should measure something that matters to patients, like reduced muscle weakness, longer time to disease progression, or improved daily functioning. Why does this matter? If a drug meets these conventional requirements, it has strong evidence that it works. But as you probably know, there are many diseases, especially rare diseases, including MPN, where running two full-scale trials is challenging or impossible. And so that's where FDA's flexibility comes in. But understanding the gold standard can help you appreciate why the bar is so high. Next slide. So this slide notes a historical consequence of the 1962 law. So after those amendments, drug developers were actually discouraged from creating therapies for rare diseases. Why? As you might guess, because performing two large, well-controlled trials in a population that might only have a few hundred or maybe even a few thousand people with a rare disease is extremely difficult. And the cost and logistical hurdles were prohibitive on companies seeking to do this. And so it simply wasn't feasible for these small patient populations. In response, Congress passed the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, which created special incentives, which we will talk about later, for sponsors seeking to develop drugs for rare diseases, which are those affecting fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. And since its enactment, this law has led to more than 800 drugs being approved for rare diseases. Just a drop in the bucket, since we know that there are more than 7,000 known rare diseases, and alas, almost all of them, in relation to the 800 approved drugs, do not have an approved therapy available. But importantly, with respect to the evidence requirements for approval, the Orphan Drug Act did not change the requirement of substantial evidence of effectiveness defined under the 1962 law. In other words, even if a drug gets orphan drug designation, the sponsor still typically has to show two well-controlled trials, unless the FDA uses one of the flexible pathways that we're about to discuss. Next slide. The first administrative flexibility path we will discuss is under FDAMA 115. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was amended, as we discussed previously, in 1962, but then again in 1997 through the FDA Modernization Act, or FDAMA, which added a key section, Section 115, that gave FDA the statutory authority to accept substantial evidence of effectiveness, not only on the basis of two adequate and well-controlled studies, but now on the basis of one adequate and well-controlled clinical trial plus confirmatory evidence. That means, as I mentioned, instead of requiring two separate trials that each hit their primary endpoint, the FDA could accept one trial that shows a clear and persuasive benefit combined with other supportive information, such as data from similar drugs or drugs with a well understood disease biology. Again, this law didn't change FDA's standard of requiring substantial evidence of effectiveness, but rather changed what FDA could consider to meet that standard. So that change occurred in 1997, but it wasn't until December 2019 that FDA issued formal guidance clarifying how it would actually interpret and apply Section 115 in practice. In this guidance, FDA clarified what it considers to be confirmatory evidence, which I'll expand on in an upcoming slide. Next, please. Quickly, just another history lesson and point of clarification because it is important. The 1962 amendment to the FDCA added the substantial evidence of effectiveness standard, requiring two adequate and well-controlled trials. In 1997, FDAMA clarified that substantial evidence of effectiveness could also be one adequate and well-controlled clinical investigation plus confirmatory evidence. Next slide. So, what is confirmatory evidence? Confirmatory evidence is any data outside of that single pivotal trial that helps FDA feel confident that the trial's results aren't a fluke. In the conventional model, two trials, each trial confirms the other by replicating the finding of the other. But if you only have one trial, you kind of need a different form of backup. And so in FDA's 2019 guidance that I mentioned, the agency provides examples of what acceptable confirmatory evidence could be. One is results from trials in a related indication with the same drug. For instance, suppose drug X treats a severe form of a genetic disease in infants, and you see strong results. You might be able to use as confirmatory evidence data from a second trial showing that the same drug works in older children or adults with a related form of that disease. Another form would be compelling mechanistic information. Maybe there is a detailed understanding of how the drug works at a molecular level, and that has been demonstrated or validated in preclinical or animal studies, or maybe even early clinical trial data that shows that that mechanism translates to patient benefit. Another kind would be well-described natural history of the disease. If you have a thorough, well-documented picture of how the disease progresses without treatment, such as through patient registries or natural history studies, you can show that patients receiving the drug diverge from the typical disease course in a meaningful way. And lastly, but not exclusively, the examples provided in the guidance are simply illustrations and not meant to be the only examples. Results from adequate and well-controlled trials of other drugs that are in the same pharmacological class as the drug seeking approval. Sometimes, if another drug that behaves similarly has already proven to work in a related population, that data can bolster FDA's confidence in the drug under review. And I also want to mention a few factors that FDA considers when deciding whether to even consider this single adequate and well-controlled trial plus confirmatory evidence approach. And sponsors think about this as well when they're developing their drug development program. First, the pervasiveness of that one trial. Was the treatment effect very large, or was the study so rigorously designed that FDA can be confident that the result is not due to chance? Second, the robustness of the confirmatory evidence. How well does it support the trial's findings? Third, the seriousness of the disease and unmet medical need. How dire is the situation for patients? For most patients with a rare disease, this is an automatic. And fourth, the size of the patient population. Is it so rare that running two trials would be nearly impossible? And fifth, the feasibility and ethics of running more than one trial. Sometimes a placebo-controlled trial is just simply not ethical, especially if there are no alternative treatments, such that you don't want some patients receiving drug and some patients receiving nothing, especially when the disease could be so irreversibly progressive. When you put one pivotal trial plus this kind of confirmatory evidence together, FDA can probably reasonably conclude, yes, this drug works, let's approve it, even without a second standalone adequate and well-controlled trial. Next. Next slide, Sarah. There we go. Thank you. To illustrate this example, we're going to look at Spinraza, which was approved by the FDA for the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, which is a rare, often devastating genetic muscle disorder in infants and children. And so the single, adequate, and well-controlled study that was conducted was a multi-center, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study in infants with the most severe form of the disease called infantile onset SMA. The primary endpoint was the proportion of infants achieving motor milestones, things like voluntary grasp, ability to kick, head control, rolling, sitting, crawling, standing, and even walking, which are all things that SMA babies would never be expected to do because of SMA. The result was striking, really. 41% of babies who received Spinraza achieved a motor milestone response, compared to 0% of babies who received nothing, the sham injection. That's a p-value of 0.0001, a very, very strong finding. Secondary endpoints like survival and other motor function measures were also numerically positive, meaning that there were trends in the right direction on those outcomes, even if they didn't reach statistical significance. The confirmatory evidence that was submitted by the sponsor was data from 6 open label studies, which would not on their own be considered to be adequate and well controlled. 4 of these trials were in later onset SMA babies. 1 trial was in pre-symptomatic infants, and 1 trial was again an infantile onset SMA. In those studies, many infants and children achieved milestones like being able to sit unassisted or even stand or walk when they otherwise would not have, similarly to the adequate and well-controlled study. In this instance, even though the single adequate and well-controlled study was only conducted in infantile onset SMA babies, because the open label studies used as confirmatory evidence were done in other types of SMA, and those studies showed similar results, FDA concluded that the pivotal trial was highly persuasive and the open label studies provided confirmatory support, satisfying the requirement for substantial evidence of effectiveness. In fact, FDA approved Spinraza for all ages of onset of SMA and all subtypes of SMA, even though the adequate and well-controlled study only evaluated infantile onset. FDA just viewed the confirmatory evidence in the other patient populations as supportive to approve the product for the entire population. Next slide. Moving on to the next type of administrative flexibility is through FDA's May 1998 guidance. And this guidance explains that under certain conditions, a single adequate and well-controlled trial could suffice for approval without any independent substantiation from another controlled trial or confirmatory evidence. So just one adequate and well-controlled trial alone. But this is strictly limited to very specific high bar situations where there is a statistically persuasive effect on an endpoint that is directly meaningful to patients, like survival or irreversible morbidity, such as preventing death or preventing permanent disability, and also where a second trial would be logistically or ethically infeasible. Typically, this means that the single controlled trial has to hit a p-value of less than 0.01. So even more than when there are 2 adequate and well-controlled studies where the p-value needs to be less than 0.05, which shows that there must be such a convincing effect that the finding itself is considered self-replicating. Thus, you don't need a second study or other confirmatory evidence. FDA would also look at consistency across secondary endpoints and consistency across patient subgroups within that single study. Next slide. So, what does an approval under the May 1998 guidance look like in practice? So, let's look at AGOMRI for Duchenne muscular dystrophy or DMD, which is a rapidly progressive genetic muscle disorder that primarily affects boys and leads to loss of ambulation and ultimately has a significant impact on lifespan. It's very tragic. So the primary study, the single adequate and well-controlled trial, was a double-blind, placebo-controlled multi-center study. The primary endpoint was change from baseline at week 24 in time to stand velocity, essentially how quickly a patient could go from lying down to standing. And this is considered a clinically meaningful measure of motor function in DMD because losing the ability to stand is a hallmark of disease progression. And the result from this study was very persuasive. The p-value was 0.0033 in favor of the drug for time to stand. Secondary endpoints were also consistent. The 6-minute walk test, which is how the distance walked in 6 minutes, and the time to run walk 10 meters also showed statistically significant improvements, both less than 0.01. And the results were consistent across several subgroup analyses when looking specifically at different age ranges of the patients as well as different baseline functionality. And the treatment effect was clearly clinically meaningful. Patients were moving more than expected without treatment. And because of the highly statistically significant and clinically meaningful results, the FDA determined that this was an adequate and well-controlled study with highly persuasive results on a clinically meaningful primary endpoint such that reliance on a single trial was acceptable. Next slide. The last category of FDA flexibility we'll talk about is accelerated approval, which is codified in FDA's regulations. And so accelerated approval is intended for serious or life-threatening diseases with an unmet medical need where a clinical outcome endpoint may take too long to measure, such as longer than 1 or 2 years, or where it may be impractical to measure a clinical outcome endpoint at that. Instead, FDA can accept a surrogate endpoint or an intermediate clinical endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict a real clinical benefit. A surrogate endpoint is something like a biomarker, something in the blood that you can measure that over time eventually eventually manifests as a clinical outcome. An intermediate clinical endpoint is a clinical outcome that you can measure today, but that doesn't really have the clinical meaningfulness that's tied to what the outcome would look like after 2 or 3 years, for example. And so, as a part of the accelerated approval pathway, FDA accepts the use of these surrogate endpoints or intermediate clinical endpoints, but in return, the sponsor must conduct a post-approval confirmatory study to verify the anticipated clinical benefit. Importantly, accelerated approval does not alter the persuasiveness of the finding required. Substantial evidence of effectiveness is still required, either through the gold standard or through one of the other administrative flexibility pathways that I talked about earlier. What it does do, though, is it changes the type of endpoint that can establish benefit, which a sponsor must provide evidence to the FDA that demonstrates the predictive value of that surrogate or intermediate clinical endpoint in ultimately measuring clinical benefit. So let's see how this works in practice. Next slide, please. So COSADI is a great example because it shows FDA's flexibility in a very unique way. So COSADI was approved for ALS, specifically ALS caused by mutations in the SOD1 gene. And so the adequate and well-controlled study that was conducted was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study in 108 adults with SOD1 ALS. The primary endpoint was change from baseline at week 28 in the ALS functional rating scale, the revised functional rating scale, which is a composite measure of physical function. So this sounds like a clinical endpoint, not a surrogate endpoint, and you would be correct. Let's keep going. This doesn't sound like accelerated approval, but let's keep going. On this primary endpoint at week 28, the mean decline in that rating scale was -7 points in the drug group, and it was actually -8 points in the placebo group. The difference was not statistically significant. So technically, the trial didn't meet its endpoint and it was considered a failed study. However, a secondary endpoint in the study was plasma neurofilament light chain, or NFL, which is a biomarker. And this secondary endpoint showed a 67% reduction in NFL concentration between drug-treated patients and placebo-treated patients, which is a p-value of less than 0.001. And so the significance of this NFL biomarker is that it's a biomarker of neuronal damage. And the sponsor was able to provide sufficient evidence to the FDA to show that a reduction in this NFL concentration should be considered reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit in ALS. So the FDA, agreeing with this, granted accelerated approval and required the sponsor as to essentially conduct a post-approval confirmatory study to then show that these NFL reductions resulted in clinical function and improves clinical function over a longer period of time, such as survival and or function improvement in functional decline. And so even though the clinical trial was technically a failure because it didn't meet its pre-specified primary endpoint, FDA granted accelerated approval on the basis of NFL reduction, the secondary endpoint, because the NFL findings were robust based on the p-value. There was also evidence to support that the mechanism through lowering SOD1 protein was compelling, and there are no other FDA approved products for ALS SOD1 specifically. And given that it's a devastating, rapidly fatal disease, there's clearly an unmet need for this product. Next slide, please. And lastly, we'll talk about case-by-case flexibility. So this principle comes from FDA's regulations, which say that although the standards for safety and efficacy apply to all drugs, the kind and quantity of data required can vary depending on the specific drug, the indication, and the population. In other words, FDA has the authority to apply its scientific judgment and adjust its requirements of the evidence required, the type of evidence required, if the situation calls for it. Under case-by-case flexibility, FDA still wants to see evidence of substantial evidence of effectiveness, but it can be creative in how that evidence is packaged. Let's see an example of this for a rare condition. Next slide, please. So this example is Zuraden for hereditary orotic aciduria, or HOA, and this is another one of my most favorite examples of flexibility, although it's probably the most extreme example as well. So HOA is an autosomal recessive disease in which patients cannot properly synthesize certain nucleotides, which lead to anemia and developmental delays. And it is so rare that there are only a handful of diagnosed patients worldwide. So, for its drug application, the sponsor relied on 19 published case reports spanning several decades that described how patients responded to use of off-label Zuridan. And that in and of itself can be a form of evidence. The sponsor also conducted its own 6-week, single arm, open label, baseline controlled prospective trial in 4 patients. And 3 of the 4 patients weren't even treatment naive, meaning that they had had some prior exposure to Zuridan before joining the trial. Again, Zuridan had been available off label for many years. But as a part of the trial, each patient's primary efficacy analysis was based on individual changes, whether it be through neutrophil count, total white blood cell count, and red blood cell mean corpuscular volume, which are all parameters that constitute the manifestations of HOA. Essentially, each patient response was evaluated against their own baseline. After 6 weeks, patients were continued on the study for up to 6 months to see if the improvements were durable. And when reviewing this application, FDA considered the combination of the retrospective case reports plus the small prospective trial, the fact that there was no reasonable way to conduct a large randomized trial because there simply weren't enough patients, and also the severity of the disease and the fact that the drug directly affected the underlying metabolic effect of the disease to grant an approval. Next slide. So now we'll turn to FDA's expedited programs. These are special FDA programs that, based on preliminary evidence generated during drug development before approval, are granted to a drug sponsor to speed up development or the review process for drugs that treat serious conditions with unmet medical needs. Next slide. The authority for these expedited programs came from FDA's own regulations following the HIV and AIDS epidemic in the late 1980s, when FDA recognized that there was a real need to expedite therapies for those suffering with serious conditions where there was no available therapy. In its regulations, the FDA says that it is appropriate to exercise the broadest flexibility in applying the statutory standards, but in life-threatening or severely debilitating illnesses, patients and physicians are often willing to accept greater uncertainty or risk because the potential benefit could be significant. Next slide. So what are these expedited programs? There is fast track designation, breakthrough therapy designation, accelerated approval, which we talked about earlier as a part of FDA's administrative flexibility, and priority review. Next slide. So this slide really breaks down each program. Fast Track can be granted by the FDA to sponsors of drugs that are intended to treat a serious condition where non-clinical data demonstrate the potential to address an unmet medical need. Breakthrough therapy designation is similar, but in order to receive the designation, the sponsor must have preliminary clinical evidence that demonstrates a potential for substantial improvement compared to available therapy. So the bar is much higher for breakthrough therapy designation. Both fast track and breakthrough therapy designations are granted prior to approval and provides the sponsor with more frequent meetings and communications with the FDA about their development program, and also provides the sponsor with a rolling review of their future marketing application for that drug. So, rolling review is when a sponsor can submit portions of its marketing application over a specific time frame as each part of the application called modules are ready, rather than waiting to submit the whole application when all of the modules are ready at one time. And this technically allows the FDA to start reviewing the application as soon as that first module gets submitted. Accelerated approval is available where a surrogate, as we mentioned, where a surrogate endpoint or intermediate clinical endpoint is reasonably likely to predict an effect on survival or other clinical benefit, but that clinical benefit ultimately must be verified in a post-approval confirmatory study. And FDA now has the authority to require that that post-approval study be underway at the time of approval. And lastly, priority review is granted for drugs that provide a significant improvement in safety or effectiveness over existing therapy. And sponsors like to have priority review because if granted, it means that FDA intends to take action or make a decision on that marketing application within 6 months rather than the standard time frame for review, which is 10 months. Next slide. Some key factors that all of the expedited programs have in common are the seriousness of the condition and whether there is an unmet medical need. For purposes of these programs, FDA defines a serious condition as a disease or condition that has a substantial impact on day-to-day functioning, and that drug either is intended to treat a serious aspect of that serious condition or just in general treat the entire serious condition. For an unmet medical need, this is based on whether there are currently available or approved products for that serious condition. If there is no available therapy, there is clearly a case of unmet medical need. If there is available therapy, a sponsor will have to prove to the FDA that there is some kind of unmet medical need in spite of available therapy that their product addresses, such as having improved efficacy over available therapy. Their product has less side effects. Their product has improved tolerability, and patients comply with their dosing regimen more than currently available therapy. Or maybe their drug uses a different mechanism of action, which would benefit patients who do not respond to available therapy. Next slide. And so, very briefly, I want to touch on three other important designation programs. The first is Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy, or RMAT designation, which are for biologic products only, like cell or gene therapy products that are intended to treat a serious or life-threatening disease, where preliminary clinical evidence indicates the drug has a potential to address an unmet medical need. So, similar to break the requirements for breakthrough therapy, but as only applicable for cell and gene therapy products. And again, this designation has similar benefits to fast track and breakthrough. Next slide. There is also orphan drug designation, which is granted under the Orphan Drug Act that I mentioned at the beginning. So this designation can be granted to drugs intended to treat an orphan disease, which is defined by the Orphan Drug Act as a disease that not only affects less than 200,000 persons in the United States, but also it could be a disease that affects more than 200,000 persons in the United States, and for which there is no reasonable expectation that the cost of developing and making the drug will be recovered from sales of the drug. And so the benefits of this designation are a little different from what we've talked about already. One benefit is that the first applicant or sponsor to receive FDA approval for a drug to treat an orphan disease that has this orphan designation will get 7 years of market exclusivity. And that means that for 7 years, FDA cannot approve a competing drug for the same indication, even if that competitor shows equivalent efficacy. There are also certain tax credits for clinical trial expenses and a waiver of the application fee for an NDA or a BLA when the sponsor submits its marketing application. And the cost of one of those for fiscal year 2025 is close to $4.5 million. So a big, big incentive for this program. Lastly is the Rare Pediatric Disease Designation Program, which has currently sunset, and we are waiting to see if it will be reauthorized by Congress since it is a statutory program. And so this program is for serious or life-threatening orphan diseases where the serious or life-threatening manifestations of the disease primarily affect individuals from birth to 18 years old. And this is a really important program because it incentivizes the development of drugs for rare pediatric diseases. And it incentivizes companies to do this because if a sponsor gets this designation and then that drug goes on to receive approval by the FDA, FDA will give that company a voucher that can be used for any future marketing application to get priority review. And remember, priority review allows essentially is the FDA saying we will try our hardest to review your application in 6 months instead of the standard 10 months. And so these are really valuable to companies. And if a company doesn't want to keep it themselves, the statute allows sponsors to sell them. And so these vouchers can fetch up to hundreds of millions of dollars because of how valuable they can be to a company who might be, for example, trying to be the first to market if there's competition in a particular space. Next slide, please. So up until this point, we've talked a lot about FDA's evidentiary standards, the statutes, regulations, guidance, and different approval pathways and expedited programs. And now I just want to spend a few minutes on where your voice comes into the approval process. Next slide. So the FDA's benefit risk framework is how the agency organizes its deliberations when deciding whether to approve a drug based on the perceived benefits and risks of the product. When considering benefit, FDA asks things such as what are the positive effects of the drug? And this includes clinical trial data on primary and secondary endpoints that reflect how a patient feels, functions, or survives. Does the drug fill an unmet medical need? How does it compare to existing therapies? Are there patient-reported outcomes that show better daily functioning or less symptom burden? In assessing risk, FDA asks things such as, what does the safety database look like? How many patients in the trials for this drug were exposed and for how long? What adverse events or side effects were observed? Were they common? Were they severe? How reversible were they? Were they manageable? If so, how? Did you just add a medication for that adverse symptom, or could you adjust the dose of the drug? And FDA will also ask whether it understands the drug manufacturing process and if there are any risks related to impurities or other parts of the manufacturing process. Next slide. So here's an example of what FDA's benefit risk framework looks like, and this actually gets put into its review documents and the approval decisions that are available online and made publicly available. And so you will see that FDA also takes into consideration the seriousness of the disease and current treatment options, as well as benefits and risks. And so when weighing the benefits and risks, FDA asks, how do these benefits measure up against these risks and what uncertainty remains? Next slide. So how does the patient voice play into this framework? Historically, FDA decisions were almost exclusively driven by data from clinical trials. But patients live with these conditions every day, and their experiences, preferences, and tolerance for risk really matter. And so, starting in the mid 2000s and codified through the Patient Focused Drug Development or PFDD initiative that launched in 2012, FDA began to explicitly recognize that patients who live with a disease have a direct stake in the outcome of FDA decisions and are in a unique position to contribute to the understanding of their disease. Next slide. So when FDA reviewers sit down to make an approval decision, they ask themselves questions about this benefit risk framework. Do the benefits of this drug outweigh its risks, which is ultimately a scientific determination? But there's also some value judgment involved. What does benefit look like for this patient population? How much risk or uncertainty is acceptable to them? Next slide. And the only way for them to know this is to understand the context in which a potential therapy will be used. And so this is where the value of patient experience data comes in. And there are two relevant categories of patient experience when it comes to the benefit risk framework. The first being the burdens of disease and its impacts on patients' daily lives. What symptoms do patients struggle with? How does the disease affect work, family, sleep, mental health, social functioning? Capturing these real world impacts helps FDA see beyond clinical trial numbers. The second is patients' perspectives on the adequacy of available therapies. Are there any available therapies? Do current treatments relieve symptoms at all? If they do, are they tolerable? Do they carry side effects so severe that patients stop taking them? This context helps FDA understand what incremental benefit a new therapy can provide. And so there are many ways FDA gets this data and hears it directly from patients. One is through public meetings and patient listening sessions or externally led patient-focused drug development meetings, which Sarah mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. The MPN RF hosted one in 2019. And so FDA has the voice of the patient report from that meeting as a reference for any drug that gets submitted to the FDA for MPN. They will be reading that report to say, does this drug address what bothers patients the most? Another way FDA gets this information is through patient preference studies or surveys conducted by sponsors or patient advocacy groups that quantify what trade-offs patients are willing to make when it comes to their treatments. There are also patient-reported outcome measures, which are another type of questionnaire or instrument, usually used and developed by sponsors in a clinical study that capture things like fatigue, pain, or quality of life from the patient perspective while they are in that clinical trial. And just by painting this picture, you help the FDA evaluate the true benefit risk balance when a drug is under review for approval. Next slide. And so I know that was a lot of information, and I'm happy to take questions. If we don't get to your question or if you think of one later, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, we do have a few minutes to answer some of the live questions asked. So you can probably see them, but I'll go through them and you can kind of help us answer some of these live, and then whatever we don't get to, we'll be sure to send out an email. But so this individual asks, at what point does the patient have an overriding say in the approval of trials or drugs? Many patients say, I would happy to take a higher risk than maybe in the FDA approved protocol.
Yes, so sponsors can certainly work with patient groups to talk and get the patient perspective on how to design a study, whether it be the endpoints that are measured, which they can get insights from, such as from the voice of the patient reports, from those ELPFDD meetings. Um, the duration of the study, perhaps how long are patients willing to be in a clinical study, especially if there's a placebo arm and the drug is progressive. Some patients might not be willing to spend time not being randomized to potentially not receive drug at all. And so these are things that sponsors take into consideration when designing their study, and FDA is also aware of these challenges that patients face when they are essentially getting care for their disease through a clinical trial because there aren't any available therapies that are approved. But in the end, the sponsors and FDA do need a study that they can be confident in that the results will generate the evidence necessary to meet that substantial evidence of approval standard. So there is some ways for patients to have input on that, but in the end, the sponsor ultimately wants to make sure that if they conduct a study, especially if they're only going to conduct one study, such as through the administrative flexibility pathways that we talked about, if they're only going to rely on one study, that they're going to knock it out of the park. And so the patient perspectives on the design of that study and the duration and the statistics required um, might have less of a role, just practically.
Thank you. Um, is there a website that shares kind of the new drugs that are being submitted to the FDA? So if patients want to keep track of kind of where a drug is in the approval process, some of these, MF drugs that are coming through the pipeline, is there a way that they can track and see where those are, or where would you suggest going to check on that information?
So FDA will not announce when a drug, when it receives an application. That's up to the sponsor to announce those, particularly if the sponsor is a publicly traded company. For example, it has stakeholder obligations to make that's a material update for them. So most of that information is public. Companies want people to know that, hey, this is big news. We've submitted an application. So a lot of companies will issue a press release about it. Some organizations might try and track drug some applications for a particular disease area because there isn't one repository, but FDA will announce approvals for drugs.
Excellent. And could you comment, and maybe not, but how kind of some of the firings at the FDA really do they affect the ability to act in some? Oh, my question just went away.
I think I see it. So So with the April 1st reductions in force, we are seeing some trickling effects of the review teams at FDA who are reviewing these marketing applications just having less manpower to act on applications. And so under legislation called PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Amendment Acts, FDA has to act on applications within a certain amount of time. We talked about priority review, that FDA should act within 6 months as opposed to 10 months. And so with these reductions in force, we are seeing those timelines slip. And so we are seeing that effect, and we've seen, such as with the vaccine, the new COVID vaccine, they missed their PDUFA date. And then there has been some other misses of those target review dates by the FDA as well.
Thank you. And I think we'll just kind of wrap up. I know we're right at 6 o'clock with one question. And if you could say what percentage does patient impact have with the FDA decision process when considering approval? Do you have any thoughts?
Oop, percentage would be tough, but I rather than putting a percentage on it, I would just say that since 2012, since the initiation of the patient-focused drug development initiative, FDA has issued several guidance documents on patient-focused drug development and what it will consider, how to develop patient-reported outcome measures. There's a whole team of folks at the FDA that help groups have patient-focused drug development meetings, and things like that. So there are so many resources at the FDA to help gather this information for reviewers and industry to consider, the patient voice, that it's definitely top of mind all the time. Sponsors will bring patients to their meetings with the FDA to hear directly from them, when on what's important if there hasn't been a patient-focused drug development meeting. And so there's many ways to interact not only with the FDA but with sponsors to get the patient experience out there. So it's definitely top of mind all the time.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sarah, for your time. This is a wealth of knowledge, and we really appreciate you educating all of these advocates on the line. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you all who's tuned in. We'll be sure to get you the recording, the slides, any additional Q&A that we didn't answer. And then I did just put the evaluation in the chat, but we'll also send that to you in a follow-up post email. If you have any questions, please still email us at patientengagement@mpnrf.org or mpnrf.org, and we'll be sure to get back to you. But thanks again, Sarah. Everyone have a
Thanks
good
so
night.
much,
All right. Bye.
everyone.